Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Interesting time between the Chequers Agreement and the White Paper we are all eagerly anticipating. We've got a lot of ground to cover, as always, in the Select Committee, so if you could try and keep your answers as succinct as possible, that would be really helpful. I've just got some questions which we'll then explore in more detail with members of the committee as the hearing unfolds. I just want to put to each of you, first of all to you, Ms. Renison, what kind of reaction have you had from your members? What is your reaction to the outlines of the proposal that emerged from Chequers on Friday?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to the committee for having me. I think at the moment it's any progress is progress. I think that was also the reaction that we found from the membership after, with every sort of stage 4 that was taken through the process of the negotiations. And I think that it does reflect, certainly in terms of the outline of agreement, that certainly on goods in terms of regulatory alignment and actual harmonisation is in line with the priorities of the membership. That was certainly a preference for alignment on goods, but also to a certain degree in services. But it was particularly pronounced in goods. And I think actually we had published data shortly before the meeting at Chequers that highlighted that actually when we were sort of presenting the two various options, the maximum facilitation and an arrangement that would obviate the need for customs declarations, the vast majority, including those who actually do international trade and are familiar with customs processes, were in favour of the arrangement that negated the need for those customs declarations, even if it took longer to put in place. So in that instance, we're in that dimension, certainly there is a warm welcome for that, but I think there's a lot of questions remaining that hopefully the White Paper will address, particularly in regards of services, but also hopefully on labour mobility.
And the implications for business tracking, I mean, you touched on that in what you said a moment ago, because under this system, in the end, HMRC are going to have to be persuaded, and indeed the EU, that an item that comes into the UK from outside the EU is going to end up in one of two places, either stay in the UK or go to the EU. And what are the implications for businesses in respect of goods and agri-foods for the cost and the time involved in tracking to offer sufficient satisfaction to the authorities that that's where the goods have ended up, so that if the duty rates differ, the correct duty rate has been paid?
Well, I think that reflects the fact that there has been a limited engagement to date with companies on the so-called elements of the customs, the new customs partnership. Right. We know that there has been, I think it's now in the public domain, that there has been some limited testing through a consultancy with HMRC of some companies. Most of them have signed non-disclosure agreements, but we would need to see far more testing of that to really be able to understand what degree of complication and cost companies would arrive at, particularly in respect of what kind of tracking mechanism would be needed. Because the issue is less about where the goods are coming from, but where they are then going on
where
to.
They're going to end up, yeah. Now, Professor Dugan, there's an interesting debate generally going on about where the dividing line between goods and services is to be drawn, and that's reflected in debate about whether our statistics are accurate. Just in terms of initial reaction, do you think it is possible to have a rigid distinction between, on the one hand, goods and agri-foods, where the government is indicating we will be fully aligned, and if the rules change in Europe, we will make the same changes here, and on the other hand, services, where that commitment has not been given, although the Prime Minister indicated a general wish to align in her Mansion House speech, and maybe we'll see more in the White Paper tomorrow. Do you think that is at a sort of technical European level, it is possible to make such a distinction, given that a number of goods these days come with a service attached? It's one package.
I think there are two issues to flag up then. First of all, we need to see more in the detail of the White Paper about what the Prime Minister's plans are, the government's plans are for services. Pre the Chequers statement, the assumption was, based on previous speeches and previous future partnership papers, that the government was seeking a deal on services, especially financial services, which would say equivalency of outcomes leading to mutual recognition. So effectively, we continue to have a form of passporting, but without necessarily having regulatory alignment. It's difficult to tell from the Chequers statement whether that will still be government policy. I think that's one of the main things I'll be looking out for in the white paper. And obviously the EU will probably not react to that proposal terribly well. So we still don't know quite what the government has in mind after Chequers. More specifically then on whether it's possible to distinguish between services and goods, well, EU lawyers have to do that all the time effectively, because we have one body of rules which governs trade in goods, we have another body of rules that governs trade in services, and although there are many similarities in the underlying principles, there are also some important differences. But from a more practical perspective, with the evolution especially of the digital economy, I think there's a growing recognition that there's a real regulatory challenge in dividing goods from services in reality. It's often referred to as servitization of the economy, whereby often people are not buying a good anymore, they're buying the service that the good represents, and the good is more or less incidental to the performance of that service. We can think very obviously of something like a mobile phone contract where you have the phone, but it's actually the mobile phone services that you're interested in. So it's technically possible, but it's not necessarily practically desirable to draw a very rigid distinction between the way that you deal with trade in goods and trade in services.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Newman, given that services represent 80% of the British economy, what is your reaction? What do you think will be the reaction of the services sector to the focus in this proposal on goods and not so much in terms of alignment, and therefore certainty about what the government is seeking in the future on services?
Sure. I think the first thing to say is that it's very welcome the government has a plan. It's taken an extremely long time to get to a clear position. So that's, first off, very welcome. We wrote a report that came out last month called Striking a Balance, where we looked at what sort of relationship we should have with the EU in economic terms and broadly came down in favour of a alignment on goods and a managed divergence on services. And part of the reasons for that, particularly on the services side, is that even if you look at the areas where the single market in services has been most effective, financial services, for example, the pattern of our trade is still much more global than it is with goods. And that's probably because of factors like language and legal system and so on, which makes it easier for us to trade outside of Europe, despite obviously the benefits that passporting and so on allows in financial services. So even in financial services, less than 40% of our trade is with the EU. So we recognise that for that very significant area of our economy, it would be difficult to leave ourselves bound by rules that are going to continue to evolve quite quickly in some areas and services, but of which we had no control. And to refer back to what Professor Duggan was saying, the question of how those rules actually continues to evolve, I think, will be problematic, and that's something that obviously the Bank of England has also expressed concern about. We felt that the government's idea of seeking mutual recognition on financial services, or the Treasury's idea, was unlikely to be achieved, and it would be better to go for some sort of enhanced equivalence approach on that basis. But overall, I think it's very welcome to have a plan. We haven't yet seen the white paper, and there's certain language in this 3-page summary that we've got which suggests harmonisation, as Ali Renison was saying, but equally there's other sort of weasel phrases like covering only those necessary to provide for frictionless trade at the border. What does that mean? And I think when we get the text of the document that Cabinet is agreeing today, we'll hopefully see a bit more.
That's very helpful. You've just referred to the extent to which we sell services to other countries in the world outside of the EU, and that is a growing market. Can you give us a couple of examples where our ability to do so is currently constrained by the requirement to align?
Yeah,
because it's a growing market, sure. Presumably we've been having success in doing so, notwithstanding those rules.
That's true. I think obviously with regulation, the businesses are always adjusted to extant regulation by its very nature. But the question is, where do those regulations change in the future is perhaps more appropriate. But there are some examples where our banks are limited in terms of the business they can do in Asia by the basis of having to follow EU rules, and that I'm not the right person to discuss all the details on this, but they have made it clear that regulatory changes in terms of the extraterritorial business they can do outside of the EU could benefit from deregulation. I think the insurance industry has also made various noises in this direction as well.
But apart from banking and financial services, are you aware of any examples with all of the rest of the service sector where alignment with European rules has stopped us from selling?
It's broadly true that the services single market is very far from complete. It's been a long complaint of Britain for a very long time, and there are all kinds of requirements in place at European level that currently prevent the free movement of services across the EU, and we've looked at some of this in our report. So I think it's...
No, I understand that, but I'm talking about our ability to sell services outside the EU currently, and the question was, apart from banking and financial services, are you able to give us any examples of where maintaining alignment thus far with European rules has stopped us selling services?
Well, I think banking and financial services would be the obvious sectors, given that those are the sectors where...
Are there any other examples you can think of?
Not to come immediately to mind.
No, that's fine, because that's extremely helpful. Stephen Thames.
Can I just pick up the points you've been making about financial services? Professor Dugan, I think you characterised the British government's aspirations as we understand it at the moment, and as you say, no doubt will become clearer tomorrow, but the government wants enhanced equivalence leading to mutual recognition. Can you just explain what appears to be in their minds?
Sure. It might just be helpful for me to point out that a couple of months ago I produced a report for the European Parliament on exactly these issues. I think a copy is probably available for the committee to peruse. So there's a lot more detail in the European Parliament report. I'll just summarise very briefly what that report said. This is relying on pre-Chequers, pre-White Paper, obviously, but the government had suggested that there should be some areas where the UK both shared the EU's policy objectives and was prepared to align with its more detailed legislation, goods being an obvious example, and we see that reflected in Chequers still. There would be other areas, at another extreme, where the UK neither shared the EU's policy objectives nor any desire to a regulatory align. And free movement of persons would be an obvious example in that category. But in the middle, there were fields where the government indicated that it shared the EU's policy objectives, but didn't necessarily want to be bound by the more detailed regulatory standards that underpinned them. And financial services was one of the main examples which fell into that category. Now, the government seemed to be suggesting, it was difficult to work it out without more detail, that as long as the UK were to keep some form of equivalence and were to sort of stay roughly in tandem, at least in terms of outcomes, with the EU's regulatory standards, that there should be no real obstacle to continuing mutual recognition, that services that are lawfully provided in the UK under UK law could be recognised as lawfully provided services across the rest of the EU as well. Now, the big problem with that proposal is that it assumes that equivalency of outcomes is enough to justify mutual recognition, and it's simply not. Mutual recognition is built on mutual trust, and mutual trust is not something which generates spontaneously. It's not something that falls out of the sky and we just trust each other across borders. It's something which is the product of really difficult, controversial, sensitive processes and institutions and structures which try to make sure that countries work together in a very closely cooperative way. They trust each other's institutions and courts, so that they feel that their public interest can be protected, even though the service is extraterritorial in effect. So to try and have similar outcomes, but without all of those standards and processes and institutions and cooperation networks, you're asking an enormous amount from the member states. And in fact, in my report, what I suggest is that the UK in these sectors isn't just asking for special treatment as a third country, it's actually asking for better treatment than the member states give each other, even within the EU. And that's not a terribly credible policy ask.
But enhanced equivalence could be credible, could it?
Leading to mutual recognition? It depends on what we mean by enhanced. If what we mean is that we're describing effectively single market membership by another name, and that is enhanced equivalence, then yes, that could be credible if it's part of a broader package, which the EU finds acceptable. But enhanced equivalence in the sense that we will still have significant policy policy alignment, but regulatory divergence. But we will still lack, for example, the common institutions, the common networks, the common judicial oversight, the common enforcement provisions. That's a very big ask, because effectively what you're saying to the member states is, why do you lot give up so much of your autonomy and subject yourself to this external supervision and oversight to get the same results as we do when we don't have to do any of those things? And that's just a really difficult policy to sell to the other member states.
So what do you think credibly the British government could seek on financial services for the future?
I think we've got the soft and not quite so soft Brexit options. Obviously the EEA or an equivalent set of agreements and institutions is what delivers single market access as we know it today. The European Council's current offer is, if you're not willing to go down that route, then we're looking at a principle of home state control subject to WTO disciplines together with regulatory cooperation so as to facilitate the movement of services. They're the two main offerings on the table. It will be interesting to see in the white paper whether the government comes up with a more detailed set of proposals which might move services closer to what they've achieved on goods. And I'm not suggesting for a second, by the way, that I think the goods proposals in Chequers are clear or workable. I think we can probably talk about that, but it will be interesting to see whether the white paper moves on services towards one or other of those two poles, something like the EEA or pretty much an ordinary free trade agreement, rather than where we are at the moment, which is a not very credible set of proposals in between.
And if the government was to seek, or if we were to end up with something like the latter arrangement that you've described, how do you think the financial services industry in the UK would respond? Or what would their reaction be to that rather reduced basis for a relationship?
I wonder whether that's a question that might be better answered by Ali.
Ali?
Sure. I mean, I think that particularly for some of the larger financial institutions, they're not waiting for the arrangements to ensure their market access, that's for sure. A lot of the bigger companies had to provide details of their contingency plans last July to the regulators in the Bank of England. I think it's particularly an issue potentially for some of the foreign banks who are here, who are their access to their presence here is largely based on their access to EU markets rather than domestic financial services providers. And I think that's where you see actually more of the discussion around potential relocation of certain jobs and offshoring onto the EU market is from some of those American and Japanese owned and Swiss banks. We know that when we asked that question to the IOD's membership looking at this question of alignment, there was still a preference for alignment with single market rules in financial services, but the share of those who preferred something that was more tailored to domestic needs was notably higher than some of the other areas.
Can I just ask one final question on this? I mean, you've explained, Professor Dugan, I think that the Commission is hostile to a mutual recognition arrangement. Is it possible that the UK government might find a better response amongst the 27 member states than the response from the Commission itself?
I'm not sure I'd say it was the Commission which is hostile. I think it's the European Council, the Commission and the European Parliament. So I think we're talking about the sort of full institutional bloc of the EU. And certainly I wouldn't describe this to being Commission resistance or Commission hostility. I think this represents, obviously within certain member states, there is a greater inclination to accommodate the UK on certain issues than there would be in other member states, but at the moment, looking at the guidelines, the negotiating mandates, the public speeches and documents, this is an institutional front, not just the Commission.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Newman.
Mr. Newman, I think wanted to add something.
Just a small exception to that. I think it was the comments by the former Italian Prime Minister, who I think said that it was unthinkable that any sort of future arrangement with the UK wouldn't include an arrangement on financial services, given the predominance of the city. And from memory, there are a few other such comments by EU leaders, but I broadly agree.
Okay,
thank you.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Thank you very much. If I may just follow up on Stephen's questions a little bit and just give an example. I had a letter from a bank, which I bank with, which is a European Union-based bank that operates in the UK, a couple of weeks ago saying we've now set up a UK subsidiary. Previously, your banking was with effectively a branch. It's now become a subsidiary. We see absolutely no problems with this. Things will continue as normal. Is this what, Professor Dugan, what you were referring to as being the kind of arrangement that financial institutions, particularly banks, would have to make in the second of your two scenarios?
I think the consequences will differ across the different fields of financial services. I think it's worth just bearing in mind some of the basic ideas that underpin equivalency regimes at the EU level. For example, not every financial service has an equivalency regime at all. The terms on which equivalency is granted differ from sector to sector. Some equivalency regimes give relatively generous market access, others give much more limited market access. And of course, equivalency is inherently a political decision and can be withdrawn at any time for political, not just legal reasons. So I think we've got to bear that in mind in the background. But otherwise, I think what's true of financial services is going to be true of lots of other sectors of the economy, whether it's services or potentially goods, depending on what happens with Chequers in the white paper. All of these things increase costs. If you increase costs, they will either reduce your competitiveness or they've got to be passed on to the consumer. And that will be true in financial services, but it will also be true in other services and in goods. So sometimes it's a matter of closing off markets altogether. You simply cannot provide this service anymore across that border. You're going to have to relocate your activity within the EU or open an actual branch and office or subsidiary there. Sometimes you can still provide the service, but you have to go through more hoops, more bureaucracy, more requirements, more licensing, more supervision, and all of that will increase your costs. So we're talking about market access being more costly or sealed off altogether, but it really depends on the context.
Can I add on to that? I think it is worth referencing the fact, though, that in terms of profit margins and fiscal bandwidth to do some of this, I think, broadly speaking, without wishing to overly generalize, there is sometimes a bit more fiscal space in financial institutions than there are for manufacturing, where the profit margins are 3, 4, 5%. And so for manufacturing, that's why the question of is relocation the only option is a much more financially existential issue than it is for a bank. And I think that's why sometimes you actually have seen a lot of the financial institutions, including some of the smaller ones, go ahead and apply for the licenses. It's not going to completely upset their balance sheet in a way it potentially would by shifting production of factory locations outside of the UK.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Now, are we seeing this work both ways? So, for instance, the Bank of England made it quite clear that all European Union institutions would be very welcome to set up here, and obviously, as the example I gave shows, some of them are doing that and are basically saying, we're very happy with this, this will work for us. Lloyds of London wanted to and have made moves to open up, and I think they have done in Belgium. I'd heard that there were some issues with that. I don't know if that's true or not. Are we seeing a similar degree of openness from our EU partners in UK institutions that are trying to, who've decided to set up, whether it's in Dublin or Frankfurt or Brussels or Paris, because they see this as a, if you like, a hedge, but also as a potential opportunity in the future?
I think there's no denying that it is certainly part of the package of opportunities that governments, including local governments and regional governments across Europe, are referencing in terms of how they encourage companies to invest, in their locale. It's worth mentioning that I think further to what you were talking about, the Bank of England has also given comfort and succor, I think, to a certain extent in terms of providing cover for contracts until at least the end of 2020, I think, in a way that hasn't been reciprocated elsewhere. And so I think in some respects the UK is leading by example in that in terms of the continuity period until new arrangements come into force. But I think also looking at some of the, and this is where actually you do see that differentiation in the single market in services, is obviously there's different reasons that companies are looking at different locales, but also in terms of the requirements given, they obviously differ from country country to country in terms of third country licensing requirements. And some countries are saying, making it very clear that they want, this can't just be a letterbox or a shell company, there has to be a substantive presence, which I think links to the question about, well, if there is a shift and relocation of certain financial services activity, it won't necessarily be all at once, potentially maybe sort of gradated over time, particularly reflecting on what the new provisions around equivalence, third country equivalence, the EU is sort of looking to pass in the future, particularly around derivatives clearing.
Mr. Newman, have you got any comments on that?
I think it's broadly agree with that. Yeah.
So just moving on to manufacturing, clearly, we discussed earlier the difference between manufacturing and services is becoming increasingly difficult, and we hope to see more in the white paper as to how difficult to distinguish. We hope to see more in the white paper as to how this is going to be tackled. But we've obviously had the very clear warnings prior to the Chequer statement about the impact on the major UK manufacturers of not having the kind of as near frictionless as possible flow of goods across borders. What kind of contingency plans have you seen among those you've been speaking with or your members as to how they will deal with such a situation if there is no agreement which brings about this kind of near frictionless trade that the Prime Minister is wanting?
So I think it's important to stress there's a range of different ways in which people look at contingency plans. One of the things that we always stress is that when you contrast the amount of people who are looking at drawing up or have implemented or have drawn up contingency plans, and then you ask the question about and what activity have you done to undertake in looking at potential relocation, the shares are much different. So about sort of half of people, half of the membership have sort of either drawn up or are planning to draw up or implementing contingency plans, whereas it's about roughly still a substantial minority, but about a quarter are sort of actively really looking at relocation. So relocation is only one of a number of different contingency options. Particularly manufacturing, it's also looking at setting up shadow supply chains, changing their sort of sourcing customers as well. Some of it is also honestly just taking on extra staff to deal with potential requirements. But I think what we're finding is that actually manufacturing is still a lot further behind financial services in terms of contingency planning. And that may also link to the fact that certain financial institutions were required to provide some of that as well. No one wants to take the decision of any relocation lightly, and it's going to be a needs-must approach to that.
Mr. Newman.
I was going to say, I think it's probably the case that smaller businesses as well have found it even harder to put in place these contingency plans and need particular support from government to do so. But it's difficult to, we would, Ali and I would at another panel event yesterday discussing exactly the same thing. But I think it's from my understanding, it's a range of different options depending on the nature of the business as well.
And I think it's just to add on to the point about the small and large distinction. The example I always give is in terms of if you look at leaving the EU and GDPR, the data protection regulation that came in. GDPR is a very known quantity. People know what it is, and still firms are struggling to comply. So when you ask them to look at modeling different scenarios, and even in some respects it potentially might be easier in some elements of planning for no deal for goods because you can model tariffs. You can't really model custom delays. You don't know how much longer that's going to need to sort of what the ripple effect is going to be. And so what you're finding is a lot of companies, particularly the smaller ones, are just saying we will put in place our changes once we know what the changes are, and once we know not only what the outcome of the agreement or not an agreement is, but also how that has to be implemented by various border agencies, HMRCs. There's kind of a sequencing process of how some of the smaller companies are looking at how they actually are able to prepare.
Just to add, if we wanted to form a more complete picture, it's worth bearing in mind, of course, that all across Europe, people are doing their contingency plans as well, which means that it's not just UK manufacturers being active planners, it's also UK manufacturers being the passive recipients of other people's contingency plans, and whether, for example, a German company is now looking for alternative suppliers, no longer to rely on a UK supplier, but simply looking for a supplier elsewhere in the Netherlands or Sweden or whatever. So I think to get a full picture, we'd need to also bear in mind the contingency planning which is being done in the EU27 and its potential impact on UK manufacturing as well.
Okay,
Thank you.
Emma Reynolds.
Thank you. If I could take you back to Mr. Dugan's remarks about whether the Chequers statement is workable on goods. It was mentioned earlier that the Chequers statement states there'll be ongoing harmonisation with EU rules on goods, but only those necessary to provide frictionless trade at the border. Will it be possible and practical to distinguish between rules on goods that provide frictionless trade and those that are not necessary for that purpose? Stephen,
I think Henry mentioned this earlier, and I think this is one of the key things to look out for in the white paper. It's an incredibly significant qualification to the common rule book, but it's one that we're given almost no guidance on until we see the white paper. I think it opens up two possibilities. On its face, and I think this is the way that it's been maybe understood in a lot of the public and political debate so far, the Chequers proposal for a common rule book sounds like effectively we still want to remain within the single market for goods. But that qualification, I think, really raises quite a serious doubt about what the government's ambition is here. Because it's quite possible that what the government has in mind with that qualification is that actually we just want to stay aligned with whatever rules are necessary to avoid physical border checks. And that's not the same as being in the common market for goods. It's possible, I suppose, to identify what that list of rules are, in the sense that I think the Commission published a very helpful slide a couple of months ago which summarised all of the EU measures which involve border controls. It's not just the things like live animals and products made from animals, and it's also the products which are subject to strict market surveillance, where they have to be checked before they're allowed to be released into circulation in the market. But there is a sort of a fairly identifiable list. It could evolve in the future, but there is an identifiable list. The alternative is, of course, that what the government has in mind is that we will remain within effectively a common market for goods. And in that case, the list of EU rules which would form the common rule book would be substantially wider, because there we'd be talking about two main categories of things. First of all, regulatory standards which do not require actual literal border checks, of which there are large numbers. And secondly, we need the default rules which govern trade even when there is no common rule. And in a way, they're the most important rules of the lot, because for large sectors of the economy, there are no EU rules, there is no EU legislation. What you have is the system of mutual recognition in default of common rules. And if you really wanted to be part of a common market for goods, you need those default rules, the free movement of goods rules. So I think there's a lot of missing detail, and it's not even just detail. I think there's a lot of missing major information in the Chequers statement about what scope this common rule book has and what the ambition is for trade in goods. It's totally unclear to me at the moment.
And that's how I think the latter of those readouts is sort of how I took it, because you end up sort of going over some of these lines multiple times, but the initial reference was they would maintain a common rule book for all goods, and then pause for harmonization only for those necessary. So you start to think, and I defer to the professor on this, but you know, there is the, I think it's the sort of Casse de Dijon ruling from the ECJ that basically kind of mandates that automatic mutual recognition, and so you're wondering if this is basically the common rule book includes harmonization and default mutual recognition where it sort of applies by default, but that is backed up by case law, and there would be a question about sort of the dispute settlement comes into effect, and the institutional provision mechanisms comes into question and into play very, very quickly on that.
It's maybe worth just adding as well that this choice or lack of clarity about whether we're talking about a common rule book to avoid literal border checks or a common rule book which would basically mean a common market for trading goods, is desperately important in itself, of course, but it has knock-on consequences for every other part of the Chequers statement. It affects the institutional provisions that might be in place. It affects the dispute settlement mechanisms, which might be acceptable to the EU or not. It affects how far this is capable of addressing the Northern Irish problems and what might be the implications for the backstop. It interacts with the whole debate about indivisibility of the four freedoms and cherry picking. So in a way, until we know the answer to this initial question, what is the scope of the common rule book, it's actually very difficult to answer all of the knock-on questions about almost every other aspect of the Chequers statement.
I think it's just good to, I think, worth re-emphasising again this point on the harmonised areas versus the non-harmonised areas, because I think that's one of the things that has been poorly understood coming out of Chequers, that obviously there are many areas where goods regulations are not harmonised, and how would that work if the UK was in this sort of relationship that's being discussed? Obviously, the slide that Professor Dugan referred to on the checks that are carried out at the border, many of the checks and regulatory standards don't need to actually be done at the border. They can be done in other respects, or with bonded warehouses, and so on. I think, of course, the EU does have some examples of near neighbours which aren't necessarily members of the single market, but do participate extensively in the single market. Switzerland perhaps being the best example. And in some areas, Switzerland has managed to not introduce harmonised rules, for example, on the REACH chemical regulations, and applies a separate regime for domestic chemicals as opposed to chemicals for export into the EU. So there is some flexibility, but would the EU be willing to offer that to the UK? Obviously, that's a very big question. And the overall question then as well of how is conformity assessed? What conformity assessment bodies would the EU be willing to accept on the UK side? Would they be willing for UK bodies to continue to assert that our goods were to an EU level? We mentioned this idea of harmonisation and the caveat that's in the summary statement covering only those necessary to provide for frictionless trade at the border. But the government also goes further and introduces an additional caveat, which is the parliamentary lock, which we haven't yet mentioned. I think that's at one level, any third country would always have the ability for its parliament to push back. There's no third country that has an automatic transfer of rules from the EU. Even obviously Norway has the ability to push back, although they've largely been unable to use it. But the UK would clearly have some degree of parliamentary lock as a third country. But what sort of situation is the UK actually envisaging? That's unclear. Are we imagining a situation where Parliament would be able to say no to only in extremis with very profound consequences on the relationship, or perhaps more regularly? And I think that will determine, obviously, what the EU is willing to accept.
If I can just pick up quickly, I think the chemicals reference is an interesting one because, in theory, one of the reasons that I suppose Switzerland doesn't entirely implement REACH is that REACH is also about a database, and it's effectively a single market mechanism, REACH, that database, and so therefore Switzerland outside of the single market does not have access to that database. So there's kind of overlapping areas here that will depend on, it's great on the one hand to say that we're going to continue to be, or the proposal is to be associate members of various European regulatory agencies, but that intersects with, are you going to have access or be included in those databases, and also are you going to continue to align with the sort of various regulations that come out of it, because the regulatory agencies themselves don't necessarily regulate in the way they would in the US. It's more of a sort of market surveillance kind of body in a certain respect. So there's different aspects of this that overlap in terms of trying to figure out what a common rule book actually looks like in terms of frictionless trade. And I do think that Henry's point is very important to pick up. Are we talking about just avoiding checks at the border or avoiding checks post-dated elsewhere altogether?
That's really helpful. Thank you very, very much. I want to just ask a question about the customs proposals. Guy Verhofstadt was recently before our committee, and I asked him about this, and he said, I quote, "We cannot outsource our competence on customs duties and customs arrangements." What is your view of the willingness of member states and the other European institutions? Obviously, Guy Verhofstadt's the lead for the European Parliament, as to whether they would allow the UK to collect tariffs on their behalf, on our behalf, on the EU's behalf.
I think I don't know. I don't have a definitive answer, but I do think that there is a desire to try and find some elements of a way through, and that's been seen from the Irish government in particular. And obviously a lot of this is being driven by the question of the Irish border, and certainly we saw, going back now a few weeks, to the sort of dispute between Max Fac and Partnership. The Irish government was quite keen to send signs that Partnership was not totally dead from their point of view, even though I think at the same time the Commission was ruling it out. So there may be a particular willingness to look favourably on a solution that would help in the Irish situation. But that's a kind of a sense rather than anything more definitive.
I'll be slightly less optimistic than that. I think when I look at the Chequers statement on the facilitated customs arrangement, and again pending more detail in the white paper, I found it very difficult to see any material or appreciable differences between the Chequers proposal and what was proposed last summer. I really struggled to see. There was a hint that we could rely more on upfront payments rather than on a reimbursement mechanism, but apart from that relatively minor change, I didn't see much difference. And I think what that means is that all of the problems which were associated with the facilitated customs, the customs partnership, remain live potentially in respect of the facilitated customs arrangement. So I think it's worth just recalling what the main problems are from the EU's perspective. First of all, we are talking about bureaucracy and burdens for business. There's no doubt that the tracking system of whatever nature it is, whether it's upfront payments, whether it's reimbursement, is going to be bureaucratic. And of course, it's easy to focus on trusted traders and the people who play the system. The problem with customs control are the non-trusted traders and the people who do not play with the system. They're the people who actually cause the problems, and they're why you need the robust regulation. But from the EU's perspective, the first big question is, will we have to do this bureaucracy as well as you? Because the system will only work if EU member states also have the same systems as the UK. Now, unless there's some clever proposal in the white paper that we haven't seen yet that would say that's not necessary, it seems quite unavoidable. So effectively what we're saying to the other member states is, you also need to create this bureaucracy for yourselves, for your business. So I think that's a major issue. The second issue, of course, is this idea of taking back control cuts both ways. You know, we want control of our borders, say the EU 27. We do not contract out control over our borders to a third country. And I think in that regard, the timing is pretty awful in the sense that there is the current Commission dispute with the UK about allegedly lax enforcement by the UK authorities against imports of Chinese goods affecting the financial interests of the EU as a whole. So the timing isn't good in terms of creating the sense of trust that would make this system work. But it's important to remember it's not just about the finances. These are about public interest regulations for public safety, for security, for the environment. You've got to trust not just that you're going to collect the money properly, you've got to trust that you're going to do all of the regulatory enforcement properly as well. And then the last problem, I suppose, is that there's only so much divergence that a system like that can tolerate. You know? If we're talking about minor differences in tariffs or minor differences in regulatory standards, the system could probably accommodate that because they probably exist already in some respects anyway. The problem comes if there's significant divergence between UK tariffs or UK regulatory policy and EU standards, because then the strain on the system will become much more serious. And I think in this case, the implications are more serious than, for example, for Switzerland or an equivalent third country because of the Northern Irish problem. Because basically, if this system doesn't work, then it triggers the backstop to Northern Ireland. And that's not a consequence that comes from Switzerland, for example.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, there are three colleagues who want to pile in on the subject we're just discussing, and so I will take them in turn. Vera Hobhouse was first.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to all of you. The big elephant in the room is obviously dispute mechanism and how you resolve disputes. Talking about the lack of clarity, I heard somebody say, well, this is a wonderful invitation for lots of lawyers to making lots of money. So what has been said actually in the Chequers statement about these dispute mechanisms, which I understood is some sort of joint committee made of sort of UK judges or UK dispute regulators and EU ones, but then there's no common oversight, so the dispute can go on forever. Or what did you read into what has been said in the statement?
There is a common.
And if I could ask you first, Mr. Newman.
So I think they're quite clear on this. That they're very clear that there will be a dispute resolution mechanism that acts as an ultimate arbitration independently between the UK and the EU in future, and therefore it's very different from the Swiss model that doesn't have a judicial mechanism. There will be joint committees of officials at a political level to seek to resolve problems in the first instance, perfectly sensible, but ultimately there must be the UK is willing to submit itself to binding independent arbitration. It says that very clearly in the text. But I think from the UK's point of view, that independent arbitration cannot be provided by the ECJ. It would have to be provided by another court.
I'll just pick up on Henry's point. I think at the level of the agreement, the dispute settlement mechanism seems pretty clear and pretty uncontroversial. Actually, it doesn't deviate very much from what you'd expect to see in an international trade agreement. Political settlement by the Joint Committee, possibility of independent arbitration. I think there are 3 points on which we'll look for greater information in the white paper. The first is whether the government has any sense yet, because there will have to be some sort of solution to an exclusivity rule. So is this, you must use the dispute settlement which was provided for in the agreement, rather than, for example, going to the WTO? So that's the first question. Will these be exclusive dispute settlement mechanisms, or will they be running in parallel with others? Second is a recognition, which I think there is to a degree in the Chequers statement, but needs to be a little clearer, that of course the jurisdiction of any independent arbitration panel is inherently limited by the requirement to respect the autonomy of EU law. And that basically means that no arbitration panel can make a definitive ruling on an interpretation of EU concepts or principles or law or regulation. It cannot rule on the legality of any EU measure. It cannot express any particular opinion on the division of competence between the EU and its member states. All of those are exclusively for the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. What that means is that in practice, even though you can have a dispute settlement mechanism based on independent arbitration between the UK and the EU, the jurisdiction of that arbitration panel would be so limited in crucial respects that there needs to be a reference mechanism to the ECJ, and the ECJ's rulings will be binding. So although the ECJ might not necessarily settle the actual dispute, it might not give the definitive answer, the ECJ has to be able to pronounce on the relevant parts of EU law and the autonomy of EU law, and its rulings will be binding on the arbitration panel. Now that's pretty clear, and there's no getting away from that. That's a constitutional requirement under EU law, and there are no exceptions, no derogations. So I think we'll be looking for a little bit more clarity on that in the white paper. But the real issues don't really come from dispute settlement at the level of the agreement. The real issues come when it comes to the legal effects of this agreement within the domestic legal systems of the UK on the one hand and the EU on the other. Because one of the things the EU will be very, very worried about, and this is through hard experience, for example, with the customs relationship with Turkey, is that it might be very easy for the EU to say, we have signed this agreement, we will give it direct effect within our legal system, we will allow individuals to go to national courts and enforce this agreement against their own member states, we will implement it fully through legislation, whereas the other party doesn't do any of those things, and then you end up with quite a serious asymmetry where the agreement means one thing for the EU and it means something totally different for the other party. So I think what the EU will be looking for in the white paper, and if not in the negotiations, are guarantees against asymmetry. So for example, the government has said there will be no direct effect of this free trade area for goods in the UK. It must be implemented by Parliament. In that case, we're guaranteed to say the EU will come back and insist. In that case, there will be an express provision saying we will not do the same. There will be no direct effect of this agreement within the EU. It has to be implemented by EU legislation. Now, that guarantees symmetry, but I think coming back to the questions about business, that will have really important implications for the way that we understand trade relations as citizens, as businesses, as corporations. Because at the moment, if we feel that we have a dispute about whether our goods are being lawfully accepted by a member state, or whether they're blocking our trade, or whether they're imposing unreasonable requirements, we simply go to a national court, we challenge it, and if we've been damaged, we get compensation. It's effectively a set of individual rights. The consequence of the dispute settlement, which is envisaged by Chequers, means that it would all be at the level of intergovernmental disputes. And unless your state positively implements those measures into national law, you as a citizen or a business basically have to go to your government and say, can you help me here at an intergovernmental level? For UK business, that is a very significant change in the way that trade operates as a system.
And I think that's why there's a big question about whether, when we looked at the future partnership paper that was published last August by the government looking at dispute settlement, it outlined a range of options. I don't think it talked about any sort of potential docking to the EFTA court, for example, and that's a big question because there is a huge difference between relying on a government to take your disputes forward and being able to have the direct right of legal redress, even under something like the EFTA court. I think the docking question comes into play with if the government were minded to consider that. Can you dock to an EFTA court just for the limited area in which your agreement covers, and particularly in respect of goods? But that's a separate question. At the moment, you can, if you are sort of able to access the EFTA court, you can directly have that right of redress. And I think to give you a tangible example, and this interplays with services, we had a member who was working in construction and had won a tender to build a factory in France. Got there and his insurance was not recognised, and sort of it basically went to the commission. This was a breach of non-discrimination, effectively, that the insurance wasn't being treated in sort of like for like in terms of reciprocity. So it's not saying that that's something that every business is going to encounter, but it is a substantive change for in terms of your ability to challenge those rights directly.
Okay. Okay. Stephen Crabb on this point.
Question of the rule book for the trade in goods. And, can I ask, Mr. Newman, you wrote an interesting piece a few days ago reflecting on the Chequers statement, where I think you were quite critical of the government for, I think, giving too much away around alignment on sanitary and phytosanitary checks and agri-food checks. Can you just explain to the committee why Open Europe takes that position? Because I think in some of the reporting up before the Chequers summit, we got the impression that the plan that Open Europe had put forward was feeding quite strongly into government thinking about the shape of the deal.
So I don't know why we didn't recommend alignment on
no, that's right.
sanitary and phytosanitary measures. I don't know why the government specifically went there, but I presume it was motivated solely by the desire to keep the border as completely frictionless, rather than as frictionless as possible between Northern Ireland and Ireland. I think that is the overarching view that the UK has taken and has driven all the extent of the compromises. We thought, and we hadn't come to a settled view on this, but I thought there might have been a case for carving out Northern Ireland as a distinct phytosanitary unit, and I think building on some existing precedents that are already in place there. But we hadn't reached a firm view. The government decided that it was going for full alignment on obviously agri-food as well as manufactured goods, and I can understand the motivations in doing so, but it wasn't one of our specific recommendations.
So would a consequence of the Open Europe plan be effectively a harder border in the Irish Sea?
Or some degree of checks, yes. Unless we, as I said, we hadn't come to, in our paper, we'd carved out agri-food. We hadn't come to a view on that either way. We hadn't looked at it, and I understand there's obviously a lot of great detail on that, which I'm not an expert on at all. But
that would run up against one of the government's own red lines, wouldn't it?
Sure, but I think it depends to what extent you think there is already a precedent for that, and therefore you're not changing the constitutional nature of the internal relations in the UK, because if there's already a precedent for the island of Ireland as a whole being a discrete epidemiological and phytosanitary unit, then you're not changing the balance by continuing to recognise that.
I think that leads on to the question. So there is, when I landed in Belfast, people who've handled livestock have to obviously report to the authorities in the airport. The question is what's the increase level? We have members who run some of the smaller ports in Northern Ireland, and they do not have the capacity to do any additional SPS checks whatsoever in terms of opening goods and stopping them. So that's a big question mark. And that's why we certainly were pretty dead set against the EU's proposal on the backstop and trying to extend it to a UK-wide approach.
Okay. Can I just ask one final question, Chair, around freedom of movement? What does the panel think would be required from government in going into the negotiations to move us forward in terms of compromising on what the government has said previously on not signing up to free movement?
I think this is one of the very big difficulties, that from the EU side, the line that's coming out of the Commission remains that the single market is an all or nothing choice. It's a binary 1 or 0. And yet at the same time we're being told if you soften your red lines a bit, then will also soften. Well, either it's a binary choice or it isn't. Either there's some point in softening the red lines, or you have to abandon the red lines entirely and agree to free movement. Now, if that's the case, then we need to be having a very different sort of negotiation from where we are now. I think the comments from the Taoiseach in this morning's papers suggesting that they're open to some degree of compromise are interesting, but I think that remains an open question. And I think that now that the UK has a plan, it's quite important that we reflect as well on the absence of a plan from the other side. But I think this is something that has avoided attention so far. The EU at the moment is offering a very thin FTA, Canada style, with which would essentially carve out Northern Ireland into a separate regulatory regime. Now, that would be obviously unacceptable for the UK. At the other extreme, they're offering a situation which would be a closer relationship than Norway, and that would, I think, be politically unsustainable in the medium term. So I think the UK has taken a very long time to come up with a plan, but there's cross-party agreement in the UK that free movement needs to change. Are the EU willing to recognise that?
I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of it's certainly, you know, what has been put forward and what we hope to see out of the white paper will be more substantive, I think, than what we've seen from the EU so far. Having said that, there are a lot of countries in the EU that when we go and have those conversations with our business counterparts in Europe or with the EU governments, they are going to ask about what is going to replace free movement. And if that's not in the white paper, it becomes a little bit of a difficult conversation because obviously the reference has been made to Switzerland. I would argue that works because they've fully accepted free movement. That's not to say, I think, and you know, the question is this putting changes or breaks or controls on free movement, or is it, you know, free movement has many legal definitions in terms of what underpins it. So are we just talking about a labour mobility scheme that is prefaced around the mode 4 sort of exchange of services, which the Prime Minister did refer to in responding to some of the questions after the statement in the House earlier this week. But I think there really ideally needs to be something setting out what would replace free movement, or what kind of labour mobility scheme that they are proposing to be able to really try and, I think, cut across to the EU member states and put forward the plan on
do your
goods
members,
in particular.
sorry, Ali, do your members want a preferential migrant scheme?
Absolutely, and I think, you know, there has been some discussion about why should we even retain a preferential scheme. I think you do have to remember that, you know, there are, whether it's the Common Travel Area, whether it's the Nordic Passport Union, whether it's the Trans-Tasman arrangement, yes, culture obviously matters, but there are lots of agreements across the world that you have preferential labour mobility schemes, indeed full-on free movement between Australia and New Zealand, where geography clearly plays a factor. So, you know, pan-European supply chains do tend to, be sort of aided by having a sort of ability to rapidly deploy, whether it's engineers or sort of consultants at a moment's notice. So there is a genuine reason for geographical purposes for why that's a preferential scheme is ideal.
Yes.
Maybe I could just add a few broader contextual points about this idea of the indivisibility of the 4 freedoms and the cherry picking, because I think we can analyse the Chequers statement and the white paper on its own terms. Another important set of questions, the interrelationship with the withdrawal agreement, particularly Northern Ireland, but then we have the questions about how it interrelates with the European Council guidelines, and especially the indivisibility / cherry picking provisions. Again, in the report I did for the European Parliament, I go into this in quite a bit more detail, but I'll just summarise the key points. First of all, this isn't a constitutional requirement of the EU. There's nothing in EU law which says the 4 freedoms are indivisible. There's nothing which says that you cannot enter into trade relationships which offer greater or lesser degrees of market access in certain sectors than others. So it's not a constitutional principle that the 4 freedoms are indivisible or that you can't cherry pick. This is really about a political imperative. And this is the EU basically saying, you cannot get a better deal by leaving than you had by being in. And it's just a very simple political, rational self-interest principle. It's worth bearing in mind that it's not new or unique to the UK. It was really first articulated in relations with Switzerland after the Swiss had their immigration referendum and wanted to introduce restrictions on free movement. There we saw the EU really for the first time articulate back in 2014 these principles, and of course the UK government signed up to them, which is part of the reason that it feels a little bit difficult now to go back and say we don't agree with this anymore. But these aren't new, they're not unique to the UK, and they are essentially political rather than constitutional. And I think what that means is that they have to be seen as part of a package. Basically, the less the UK asks for in some sectors, the more it can get away with in others. So if, for example, we're talking about fully fledged common market for goods, then the EU will begin to feel uncomfortable about offering that without also extensive provisions on persons, because it will destabilise the relationship with Switzerland. That's exactly what the confrontation with Switzerland was about. Whereas if the UK is effectively saying we can live with no common market for goods, but the avoidance of literal border checks, this is simply about not having border checks, primarily for Northern Ireland, then the EU might say, well, that's not that different from what was on offer already anyway, so we can live with a mobility framework for persons. So I think it has to be seen as part of the much broader package. What is it we're asking for, and what is it we're prepared to give in return?
Very quickly, I think it's kind of on this indivisibility point. The Commission's own website refers to the Ukraine agreement as allowing the Ukraine an unprecedented level of participation in elements of the free market, single market. Obviously, Ukraine doesn't have itself any provisions on free movement. Equally, Switzerland participates in the single market very effectively for goods, but not for services. So they have chosen to divide them. I think the broader point, perhaps, about cakeism, having it and eating it, I think the UK can turn around, and the EU will also be able to say, if the Chequers deal did become a plan, that we are asking for fewer obligations, but we're also asking for fewer rights. So clearly, taking rules on goods is a worse position than making rules on goods. And therefore, the UK is not having as good an arrangement as being a member. Equally, we would lose automatic passporting on services. We'd lose the right to free flows of capital across to buy French or Dutch companies. So I think the EU, if it chose to, could construct an argument that the Chequers plan is considerably worse than membership if it wanted to, but that's probably going to be a political call.
Just to come back to...
Well,
just very briefly, just to come back to Mr. Crabb's original question. When you ask companies in the services sector what matters in terms of access, it's always about people. Because there is some harmonisation around state aid and competition and consumer law and services. There isn't a huge amount of full-on. It's more to do with sort of default kind of mutual recognition and some sectoral services harmonisation. But the thing that matters most for a services sector economy is that movement of people, and that's the sort of when you ask people about what matters for services access, I would say that is what unites companies, whether they're in manufacturing services. That is the most important aspect.
Okay, now Christopher Cho, lastly on this point, and then I'm coming to Jonathan.
How much confidence do you think we should have that the members sitting at Chequers last Friday knew and understood all the ramifications which you have so expertly brought to our attention today, particularly about individual redress and about what we mean by the scope of the Common Rule Book? Do you think this is already they knew what they were doing when they signed up at Chequers, or do you think they were doing that in the dark? And following on from that, can I ask you about a specific aspect of this Common Rule Book? Because when the Prime Minister was asked about this on Monday, I think by Jeremy Lefroy, no, not Jeremy Lefroy, anyway, one of our colleagues, who was asking about what impact is all this going to have on the live export of animals for slaughter. And that was one of the issues which those of us who were campaigning for leave made much of during the referendum, that this was going to be an example of where we could get better animal welfare standards, because we would be able to have an outright ban on the export of animals for slaughter. Would that be adversely affected by this common rule book? Because it didn't seem that the Prime Minister was able to answer that question straight on Monday. And my third point is this, that the fallback position, the backstop, what is there to stop the United Kingdom saying to the Republic of Ireland from the 29th of March next year, there will be no restrictions on goods coming into the United Kingdom across the border, across the Irish border. There will be no tariffs, there will be no quotas, you can have free flow of goods. And then, surely, there won't be any friction at the border unless the EU chooses to impose some friction itself. Isn't that a way forward for us which is consistent with our red lines?
I think on the live animal slaughter, I understand that George Eustace, the Agriculture Minister, addressed this yesterday, but I didn't see his answer, so I don't want to go there without seeing what his understanding of where the policy would be left on the basis of this commitment. In terms of the cabinet, I think there are legitimate questions that should be asked about the nature of decision making in recent weeks, and particularly the way that certain ministers have been kept in the dark about policy. I think that's highly regrettable, and that that seems to have continued again this week with the white paper presented to cabinet ministers late last night for agreement at some point this morning. I don't think it's a particularly effective way to operate, and not least because, of course, the burden and the onus is not just on the cabinet minister, him or herself, to read the document, but presumably their department also needs to have time to process the document and understand all the implications within it. So I think the government should reconsider the way that they are making decisions. But equally, having said that, getting the cabinet together and having a full away day to discuss all these things was very welcome. And as we referred previously, we have now a plan, which is a good thing. In terms of your point about the Irish border, I think I don't think it would be legal in WTO terms to leave the border completely open, but my colleagues can speak to that more clearly. I think an interesting point, though, is if we did leave and the backstop kicked in, whereby we'd have to align on regulatory terms with the elements of the single market, essentially pertaining to goods. Presumably then the UK would be responsible for any internal UK checks. What would happen if the UK then voluntarily continued to align on goods with the EU's rules, and therefore there was no need for those checks to take place in the Irish Sea? And how would that then not be essentially participation in the single market for goods only? I put this point to a very senior commission official who admitted that this was exactly a risk, and equally that the backstop on the EU's own interpretation was an example of cherry-picking the four freedoms, because clearly the backstop is essentially participation in the single market for goods only. They say, well, there are special historical circumstances and political circumstances for Northern Ireland. They say it's very small. In reality, Northern Ireland is bigger than at least 4 EU countries in population terms and in size terms as well. So I think there are difficulties that they've got into with this backstop as well, and equally trying to agree a backstop which inevitably prefigures the future relationship in the first phase of the negotiations is and remains very, very difficult, because clearly whatever we agree through the backstop and with the backstop has a strong chance of becoming the nature of the future relationship if a partnership like this can't be made to fly.
I think on picking up the ban on live animal exports, I mean, this is completely grounded in WTO commitments. In fact, I'm trying to think of I think there was one attempt to do it by either Australia or Indonesia after a particularly horrifying case, and they were challenged and they had to withdraw the ban. So the single market commitments are very much grounded in WTO law. Now, technically, if the UK was a fully independent third country, no agreement with the EU whatsoever, you could conceive of a case where the way the WTO works is there are rules, but people sometimes do things and then cases are brought against them. But I think because of the case law precedent, there wouldn't necessarily be a huge degree. It would depend on the sort of very fine details. I know that the EU Commission has been trying to look at ways around this, but not amounting to a total outright ban. But it's important to say that is very much grounded in WTO commitments. And the second point of that, just picking up what Henry was saying, I think leaving aside the fact that the Prime Minister in her Mansion House speech said very clearly that was not the approach the government was going to take, there are obviously sort of most favoured nation implications, but also in terms of what you talk about in terms of trying to say we're not going to have any tariffs for Ireland. You can't do that for one member state. It's treated as a bloc, obviously. So it would have to be negotiated jointly with the EU. There are certain aspects of border control that are in the purview of member states, but in terms of trade policy agreements, those are definitely within the purview of the Commission and the member states themselves. So I think that's worth remembering. And also I think there's a question about import control on sort of health measures. I would find it hard to believe that we would just disregard all of those measures completely under that circumstance.
I'll pick up on just a couple of the questions as well. I don't know enough about live animal slaughter to provide a reliable answer, I'm sorry. On the first point about did the people at Chequers understand the full implications? This is an incredibly complicated machine of variables and factors. I think anybody in the world who claims that they understand the full implications of what we're talking about probably needs a reality check. But I think what I did find peculiar, I suppose, in the reaction to the Chequers statement, having read it and thought, I just don't have enough detail here to know exactly what it means. I don't know enough about what the compromises are until we see the white paper to know what the implications are going to be. I think some of the reactions I've heard to the Chequers statement on both sides of the debate have perhaps been a little premature. Second point on the Northern Irish border, I don't think it's an option for the UK simply to say, well, we don't want a border, it's the EU who's forcing it, for two main reasons. First of all, it would be highly problematic in WTO terms to not police your own customs border. We would find ourselves, I think, in real trouble with the WTO if we chose not to police our own customs border and impose our appropriate tariffs and all the rest of it. And also, we would endanger our own public interest if we had simply an open border where goods and so on could flow into the country unchecked and unsupervised. It's not in the public interest of the United Kingdom to have a border like that. The real questions, I think, are what will the backstop be? And how will it interrelate with the Chequers statement? On the first question, what will the backstop be? The Chequers statement seems to suggest, but it's not entirely clear, that the UK, if this is accepted, would be willing to live with the EU's backstop proposal. It's not clear, but it seems to suggest that the UK could live with the EU's backstop proposal. That's a pretty big assumption. It assumes, first of all, that these proposals are acceptable and workable, and I've indicated that I'm not sure they will be acceptable or workable. Secondly, it assumes that it will solve the problem of the Northern Irish border. That's probably a more technical problem of just checking the list and making sure that everything that needs to avoid a hard border is on this list as well. But the third assumption is probably the most difficult one. It assumes, first of all, that trade policies do not diverge significantly in the future, so the system remains stable. It assumes that Parliament effectively doesn't engage in the regular rejection of the common rulebook and doesn't regularly antagonise the system. Because if either of those two contingencies happen, either if the divergences become so significant in trade terms that the system doesn't feel workable anymore, or if Parliament were to consistently reject developments in the common rulebook, then we would activate the backstop. And whatever that backstop is, would be the solution that has to be provided to Northern Ireland. So if the government signs up to the EU backstop, it has to be in the knowledge that that backstop really is capable of coming into force. It's not a purely theoretical backstop. It could well come into force.
Interesting. So it could be a forward stop in other circumstances. Right, Jonathan.
Yeah, sure. You say that I hadn't realised this, that the white paper hadn't actually been produced in time for the Chequers meeting, and it's only being approved today. But as I understand it, the previous Brexit secretary said that there was a draft white paper that was almost complete,
yes,
which had obviously done the rounds in Whitehall, and seems to have been completely discarded in favour of an alternative white paper which has been drawn up in secret by unelected officials at the behest of the Prime Minister. Is that your understanding as what's happening as well?
My understanding is that there have been several drafts of the white paper. I haven't, from speaking to officials and ministers, I think different bits have been seen by different people at different times. But my understanding is that there is a current draft of the white paper post-Chequers, of course, because Chequers made some changes to the, as we reported, there were some changes made to the government's position that was presented at Chequers during the course of the day, and the white paper would inevitably have to reflect that, and is now going to ministers. I think there is a separate problem that continues and has continued over several years, including when I was working as a special advisor in government, that at times departmental officials are asked to advise on policy for the centre without the knowledge of their Secretary of State. And I think personally that is constitutionally wrong. Departments have personality through the Secretary of State and shouldn't be independently working with the centre. But that's an ongoing issue that was around under a previous Prime Minister and presumably Prime Ministers before that as well.
Okay.
That's a whole other bunch of territory. But we won't go down there. Right, Jonathan Ginogly is next.
Chairman, I'll move on to the implementation period, if I may. And so to all witnesses, is the implementation period long enough to negotiate, ratify and implement the future EU-UK deal?
I think that's a question probably for government.
Well, can I add to Ali Renison, actually? It would be interesting to have an update on businesses changing attitudes towards the implementation period as well. So let's start with...
Yeah. So I think the question could be answered if also adding on, is it long enough for business to make those adjustments? And you have to figure out what the milestones are and how much progress is being disclosed as the negotiations actually go on. Because, as I said, a substantial number a majority of the IID's members have said that they are going to wait for at least the withdrawal agreement, but also the future arrangements to be put in place before they really sort of draw up substantive contingency plans. So the question there is that, I think there was a reference, even if it was a sort of, not the scenario the government was envisaging, but from a Treasury Minister back in January talking about, the potential for an agreement on customs and VAT to potentially be done at the 11th hour at the end of 2020, and how much planning can HMRC do to implement that before the details are actually known while it's being negotiated. And then the question, I come back to what I said earlier about because whatever agreement is reached on customs and sort of regulatory measures and VAT then has to be implemented into guidance that's disseminated by sort of various UK regulatory bodies, non-governmental bodies as well, and then businesses will make that adjustment based on that because they'd rather have the hard data first. So it depends on how quickly the detail of those negotiations leads to practical implementation from the domestic side and from the EU side. So it really depends on how much detail is produced in the negotiations early on. And I would add to that, I think, just to append to the earlier question, about the white paper. We're all looking forward to the white paper, but the big question is what goes into the drafting of the political declaration that accompanies the withdrawal agreement, because that is actually, a lot of the EU member states are looking to see what's in the white paper, but they will also be waiting for the actual formal draft of what the UK wants to put into that. Is it a sort of 27+1 document? Is it drawn up together? Is it done like the withdrawal agreement where the EU effectively put a text and then the UK has kind of effectively responded to that? So a lot of people are sort of focusing on the white paper for understandable reason, but the big question is how much detail is going to go into that political declaration versus waiting for the once we're formally a third country and then the technical negotiations actually begin. So it really depends on how much detail is disclosed at what stage of the process.
So in effect you're saying business could yet change its mind on whether the implementation period is long enough. They haven't taken a view.
It would depend on how far we get into the negotiations on the detail. In terms of the usefulness, I think when there was a provisional political agreement back in March, I think, or in January, I can't remember where it was first discussed in the Council guidelines. That was a huge sigh of relief, but because both sides have really been reiterating, not just the EU, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Businesses aren't going to over-rely on that. It really needs to be nailed down first.
Michael Dugan.
I think there's a widespread assumption, first of all, that the transitional period has been sorted out. It hasn't been entirely. There are still, just as with the separation issues, there are still a range of issues around the transitional period which remain open and haven't yet been concluded. It's slightly misleading because the entire text is in green in the colour-coded document, but that's not an accurate reflection of the state of the negotiations over transition. I've got a relatively lengthy list of the open questions if you'd like them, but I'll focus in then on the question.
It might be helpful if you could send those in.
Sure. I'll focus in on the question of sufficiency. Whether it's sufficient in time depends on what its objectives are, and there are actually two objectives to the transitional period. The first is to give everyone adequate time to prepare, not only business, but also state and public authorities. And of course, what adequate time to prepare means it depends on what the future is going to look like. So until we know what the future looks like, we don't know whether it's adequate time to prepare. But to give a couple of examples, we tend to focus on the idea of customs. Will we have enough time to get the ports ready for new customs checks? Will we have to recruit new customs staff? It's not just about that. If we're excluded from the European Medicines Agency, do we have enough time to convert our existing public regulatory bodies into an alternative European Medicines Agency, to train the staff and recruit them and resource it? A huge number of things need to be done within the transitional period, but depending on what the outcome of the future relationship might be. Secondly, and just as importantly, the purpose of the transitional period is to ensure only one regulatory change. So the idea is we leave in 2019, we have the transitional period, which will be a prolongation of the status quo, and then seamlessly we'll enter into the new relationship at the end of the transitional period, so there's only one regulatory change, both for public bodies and for businesses. That is a massively optimistic assumption, because assuming that we can reach any agreement on the future relationship at all before this withdrawal agreement needs to be finalised, that needs to be converted into, through a set of complex multilateral negotiations, a final agreement. It is very difficult to look around the world and see a precedent where such a large and complex and politically sensitive negotiation could be concluded within such a short period of time. But equally importantly, of course, it has to be ratified by the UK Parliament, by the European Parliament, and almost certainly by the 27 parliaments of the other member states. Yeah. So I think the one regulatory change bit of the transitional period is the really optimistic one. It might well be that what we're doing is effectively postponing the regulatory cliff edge until the end of the transitional period, and then we'll have two regulatory adaptations, one to default, and then possibly several years later to the new relationship. What's really surprising, though, a very final point, and for me I think this is one of the most disappointing parts of the withdrawal agreement as it stands in its current draft, is that there is no facility to extend that transitional period if it proves to be insufficient.
Coming on to that. I'll come on to that actually, if I may, but Henry Newman first on.
3 points to make. One of which is obviously the purpose of the transition was to provide certainty to business, which I think has been welcome. Obviously that certainty is not perfect given the state of the negotiations. I think there is a counter argument which runs that the longer that a transition is potentially extended, the greater the uncertainty about when we're actually going to move to future relationships. And I think that needs to be taken into account, that uncertainty obviously has significant costs for businesses trying to make investment decisions, and actually an open-ended transition could cut the other way as well. Second point, I think phasing. It's clearly the case that neither the MAX-FAC nor the new FCA customs arrangements would be ready by the end of 2020, but I think there would be a case for ending the standstill transition at the end of 2020, but maintaining a sort of customs union for a period beyond that, so as to allow time for other customs arrangements to be phased in on both sides. So I think, and that was left open by the Prime Minister back in Lancaster House, where she spoke about phasing before she spoke about a formal standstill transition, but she did say that we could have phased exits from different elements of EU programmes. So I think that will probably need to be thought through more carefully. But I do think there's a very strong imperative to actually end the standstill transition at the end of 2020 and move on with the future relationship, whatever that's going to be. And the third point, I think we've spent an enormous amount of time in the negotiations so far still discussing phase one issues with the EU, and we still don't have agreement on the Irish border question, as we were saying, even if other areas are largely resolved. It's incumbent on the EU member states, the 27 and the Commission, under the terms of Article 50 itself, to reach agreement on the framework of the withdrawal during the Article 50 period. So I think they are under a EU law obligation themselves, as I understand it, to reach that agreement. I don't think they're doing enough in that direction. It looks like we're going to have a relatively narrow political declaration by the end of the Article 50 period, and then a lot of that will be resolved during the transition period, which will really be, obviously, as we know now, an extension of the negotiation period. But actually, I think if you look at the terms of Article 50, it was clearly intended that the framework for the future would also be set during that time period.
And just to come back on that, I think the phased reference is quite important, because you actually see that even in the various drafts of the withdrawal agreements as they're updated, and it was a joint statement several weeks ago. And you see in terms of the withdrawal agreement that actually access to certain customs databases are extended beyond 2020, summer 2021, summer 2023. So I think that principle of sort of phasing is actually already there in the withdrawal agreement. And I think that actually does call into question the idea that you're only going to have one single sweeping regulatory change completely.
If there's not enough time during the implementation period, what are our options? Let's start off with Michael Dugar. I mean, would it be better to bite the bullet and extend the leaving period, or I think the European Union have already said it's going to be difficult to extend the implementation period because it attaches to Article 50 and there are constitutional issues.
Yeah.
Or would it be better to have another agreement to have an implementation of the implementation? Legally speaking,
Yeah.
what are our options?
It's disappointing.
Brief answers on this, because I've got 6 more colleagues who want to come in, and I want to bring them all in.
I'll just do it legally, if I may.
Just legally.
So might a
By
professor
far the preferable option would have been an explicit facility to extend the transitional period in the withdrawal agreement. The EU has said very clearly, and I think this is constitutionally correct, that Article 50 is the only legal basis for a transitional period. And it's also worth pointing out that it's being treated as an entirely exceptional competence in terms of the transitional period. They are doing things under Article 50 that would never be acceptable under other provisions of EU law. There is a bit of an unspoken consensus that in order to sort this out, we are doing things under Article 50 that would not ordinarily be possible under the treaties. Yeah. So it's not just that Article 50 is the sole legal basis for transition, it's also a very generous and very malleable legal basis for transition. But once we've left, Article 50 effectively has exhausted itself as a legal basis, and if we need another transition, it will have to be dealt with under the ordinary processes and competences of the EU. That just will not happen, because there we're talking about negotiating something which would be just as complex as the future relationship itself and require full national ratifications as well. Yeah. By far the preferable solution would be an extension facility within the Article 50 agreement.
Thank you.
That's very helpful. Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Chair. Professor Dugan, I want to go back to the issue of governance and dispute resolution, which you spoke about earlier, and just to look carefully at what the Chequers Agreement says and ask you a couple of questions about the language used. The Chequers Agreement says that the UK and the EU would establish a joint institutional framework to provide for the consistent interpretation and application of UK-EU agreements by both parties. And they say this would be done in the UK by UK courts and in the EU by EU courts, with due regard paid to EU case law in areas where the UK continues to apply a common rule book. Now, if I can just pause there, the phrase due regard, that's a term of legal art we can recognise from other treaties, isn't it? Can you explain for us what paying due regard means in legal terms?
Yep, I think what we're looking at there is for the UK courts to take into account. They're not bound by them. They can choose whether or not to follow it, but essentially if the ECJ case law is relevant, then they can have regard to it. They can take it into account as a factor in their own deliberations. Now, there will be inherent limits to that. It's not strictly binding, so the UK courts, of course, of their own volition, can decide not to follow the ECJ case law. But equally, of course, it can't defeat a parliamentary will. So if there's a statute of Parliament which is clear and precise and requires the UK courts to interpret legislation in a way which deviates from the ECJ case law, then it's not a matter of volition, it's a matter of parliamentary will. I think the UK courts, though, will be very conscious that case law is just as capable of giving rise to trade disputes and trade barriers as legislation is. One of the roles of any joint committee in an international trade agreement is both to track legislative divergence and deal with the consequences, but also to track judicial divergence and deal with the consequences. So judges tend to be very conscious that if they reach a decision which departs from ECJ case law in a significant way that would lead to trade barriers between the two parties, the judges are creating a political crisis, as in inverted commas, for the functioning of that trade agreement, which will have to be resolved by the joint committee. So that obviously acts as a bit of a restraint on the judges. They know that there are serious consequences to their actions. So
due regard means that if the British courts in the United Kingdom are paying due regard to EU law, then they're taking it into account.
Yeah.
And those words take into account are the words that are in the Human Rights Act, aren't they, in relation to the Strasbourg jurisprudence and human rights?
Effectively, we can say it's quite similar to the Human Rights Act. It's similar. There's one model where we can look to that provides an interesting comparison, and that would be the EEA system. because the EFTA Court in particular has an obligation which is quite similar to the one which is suggested in Chequers. They're bound by pre-EEA EU case law, but post-EEA agreement EU case law, I can't remember the exact words, but it's due account or due regard, but something very similar. But on a voluntary basis, the EFTA Court, knowing that if it significantly diverges from the ECJ's case law, it will create trade barriers and trade friction within the EEA, will strive to reach the same conclusions as the ECJ in practice. So on a voluntary basis, the ECJ's case law is regarded almost as binding, but of course it's not strictly binding. And I think that's probably the situation that would be the consequence of the Chequers-style deal if it were accepted.
That's very helpful, thanks. Just looking at what else the Chequers agreement says about dispute resolution, it says this joint institutional framework would also include robust and appropriate means for the resolution of disputes, including through a joint committee, which you mentioned earlier, and in many areas through binding independent arbitration, which Mr Newman mentioned earlier. And then it says, accommodating through a joint reference procedure the role of the Court of Justice as the interpreter of EU rules, but founded on the principle that the court of one party cannot resolve disputes between the two. So it seems to envisage that there will be a joint reference procedure. Could you explain for us how that might work?
Okay, I think this partly comes back to what I said before about the autonomy of EU law.
Yeah.
I'll go over it a little bit again, just for the sake of precision. We have to distinguish between dispute settlement, enforcement, interpretation at the level of the agreement, intergovernmentally, within the terms of the agreement, and within the domestic system of each party, within the UK legal system or within the EU legal system or the legal systems of its member states. So these provisions about dispute settlement through a joint committee and arbitration are about interpretation and enforcement at the level of the agreement. The due regard provisions are about the other context, enforcement and application within the UK legal system. But the two things are very separate. At the level of the agreement, the joint committee, the arbitration system, there's nothing in the Chequers statement which doesn't feel familiar and obvious in a way. There are a few points which will need greater clarification, but in a way it's standard stuff for an international trade agreement. The reason you need a reference procedure to the ECJ is because of the autonomy of EU law. Because there are certain issues where the ECJ has an absolute monopoly on those disputes, the interpretation of EU rules or concepts or principles, the division of power between the EU and its member states, the legality of EU action. Whether you have a dispute settlement mechanism at the level of the agreement, which is through a joint committee or through an arbitration panel, neither of those bodies can touch what belongs exclusively to the ECJ. So they have a reference mechanism whereby they can send the dispute to the Court of Justice for a binding ruling, and it must be binding, it can't be advisory, and then they proceed on the basis of the court's binding interpretation or guidance. So that's pretty standard stuff. There's nothing unusual about it. There's a couple of open questions about the precise design, of course. The UK, for example, says it will be a joint reference. It can't be done unilaterally by either party. So effectively, they both have to agree to send the dispute to the ECJ. But otherwise, the system feels quite predictable.
I mean, that's the position. In relation to the association agreements, the EU insists on similar provisions, don't they, that ultimately, if a dispute can't be settled politically, it's up to the Court of Justice to interpret EU legislation. That's the position in the association agreements.
It differs from agreement to agreement. There are some agreements which rely on the Court of Justice as the dispute settlement body. So there is no independent arbitration panel. The independent arbitrator is the Court of Justice. And there are certainly EU agreements, not many, but there are some which use that model. There are other models which don't have any independent arbitration at all. They rely entirely on political dispute settlement through the joint committee. And in some of those agreements, the joint committee can make a direct reference to the ECJ for binding interpretation. In others, the joint committee doesn't engage with the ECJ at all. And there you really are relying on purely political resolution of your disputes, which will usually boil down to negotiation and compromise or sanctions and countermeasures.
But it's important for us to understand that if there is a procedure for a joint reference for a ruling of the Court of Justice, at least so far as the European Union is concerned, that ruling would be binding.
For both parties, it would be binding.
Parties,
the EU cannot sign an agreement which doesn't provide for the ECJ's rulings to be binding. If the ECJ gives a ruling, it is never advisory, it is always binding on all of the relevant parties, not just the EU side, also the UK side. The ECJ would strike down a draft trade agreement which didn't explicitly provide for its rulings to be binding on all relevant parties.
So is it fair to say then, with this paragraph in the Chequers Agreement, the Prime Minister has relaxed her red lines on the Court of Justice?
It's a carefully phrased formulation in the sense that it says that the ECJ will not settle the dispute. And strictly speaking, the ECJ does not settle the dispute because it's only a reference for interpretation. The actual dispute is still settled by either the Joint Committee or the Arbitration Panel, but the ECJ's guidance is binding, not advisory.
But that's the position as we currently stand, isn't it? If a Scottish court or an English court makes a reference under EU law to the Court of Justice, the court makes a ruling, but ultimately the dispute is decided by the Scottish court or the English court. So in actual fact, we will be under the Chequers Agreement, we'll be continuing that pattern because rulings will be coming to courts in the United Kingdom from the Court of Justice. So it is a relaxation of the red lines, isn't it?
It's half true. It's exactly how the system works at the moment with preliminary references from national courts. So a dispute arises in the UK, you go to a UK court, it involves a matter of the interpretation of EU law, the UK court sends a reference to Luxembourg, the Court of Justice sends back its binding interpretation, and then the UK court picks it up and runs with it and applies the binding interpretation and settles the dispute. That is basically the system which applies here as well. It's half of the EU system works like that, half of it doesn't. Because, of course, when you do have a direct dispute between, say, the Commission and the UK, which goes to the ECJ settles that dispute. It's not a purely interpretive preliminary reference. That is a binding decision by the ECJ that finally disposes of the dispute. So, strictly speaking, the Chequers Statement has been carefully crafted not to cross the red line. In practice, of course, the ECJ's rulings will be binding on the UK, as they are on the EU, but strictly speaking, it's the Joint Committee or the Arbitration Panel that will settle the dispute.
I mean, I think it does call into question how easily these the references are made. So one of the interesting things about, and I would defer to Professor Dugan on this, but it's often been talked about that the Norwegian courts don't give preliminary references as easily as some might do in order to avoid the direct jurisdiction, so to speak, indirectly, I should say, of the ECJ itself. So it does depend on how willing the parties are to make those references.
A lot of these things are, I have to say, relatively theoretical, because it's incredibly unusual for trade disputes between countries to end up going to the ECJ even for a preliminary reference. In a way, we're arguing a lot of political capital is being spent arguing on something which is probably never going to be used in practice, or at least only very, very, very rarely.
But would I be right in understanding what will be more important for the enforcement of individual rights, whether by individuals or corporate entities, will be this phrase paying due regard?
So if we set aside then the intergovernmental dispute settlement at the level of the agreement, we're then talking about the internal legal effects within the UK legal system and every other legal system of the EU27. That's where we'll see the really major changes.
Okay. Now, Stephen Kennett was next. I'm going to get through everybody.
Try and be as quick as possible.
We'll just have to watch the time.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, just a quick process question. The Secretary of State, the former Secretary of State for exiting the EU, I should say, said that he believes that if Parliament votes on the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration and it goes through, that it will be possible to start negotiations with the EU on turning the political declaration into a legally binding treaty prior to the 29th of March of next year, i.e. from the moment that Parliament votes it through, you can then start the negotiations. But we've also heard evidence suggesting that you can't really begin to turn the political declaration into a legal treaty until such time as the UK is a third country. So formally speaking, the European Commission wouldn't set up its team for those negotiations, because the team that it sets up is based on would be based on Article 218, and you can't have that whilst Article 50 is still in effect. I'd welcome the panel's comments on that, perhaps starting with Professor Dugan and then others.
The latter interpretation is correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
From some of the discussions that I've had in Brussels, you know, formal negotiations are one thing, but how much work can you do to sort of start doing the substantive preparations for the mandate? I think it also comes back to the question of how detailed do you actually want to make the political declaration in a sense, because we would prefer, from a business perspective, to see as much detail as quickly as possible, but is there a potential that trying to effectively negotiate as much detail as possible through the political declaration actually holds up the withdrawal agreement itself, which in turn holds up the actual move on to the substantive negotiations for the future? So I think there is that legal dimension, but in terms of the substantive question about how much do you want to put into the declaration now versus wait for the formal negotiations to start, that's a political question, in my opinion.
Draw the same distinction that Ali Renison just made, but also to say that I think this takes us back to something that Professor Dugan was discussing, the limitations of Article 50 as a highly deficient, which Britain and the Commission are both now amply demonstrating. It's very suboptimal clause in a treaty which we're now limited in our ability to use. But I think it obviously makes sense for those, if it's not legally possible, that's one thing, but it obviously makes sense for as soon as the conclusion is reached on the withdrawal agreement for formal discussions to begin. Whether that's a mechanism can be found to do that, I think would obviously be welcome.
But we note Professor Dugan's view that in practice that won't be possible, because the Commission won't set up a team to make that happen until such time as the European Parliament has given its assent.
We have to distinguish between formal negotiation, which will require negotiating mandates from the Council, and those cannot be delivered until after withdrawal, and more informal negotiation. I think it also depends, of course, on what the nature of the future relationship is likely to be. If we're talking about something relatively off the shelf, if we end up with a free trade area, a free trade agreement, effectively like Canada, or if we end up with an EEA-style agreement like Norway, there we're dealing with known quantities, and we can more or less refer to them in not that much detail on the text, because all the detail is known behind the text. We all know what they look like. If we are talking about something more bespoke, then there has to be more detail, because then everyone is going to want to know what's bespoke about it. What are the safeguards, the limits, what are the institutions and the processes? So in a way, the less ambitious the agreement in terms of being bespoke, the easier it will be to have a reliable political declaration. The more ambitious and the more bespoke and special, the much more difficult it's going to be to have a detailed.
Thank you, that's very clear. The point that you made there in your initial comments, Professor Dugan, about trust and the key role that institutions play in building trust, isn't it the case then that an institution such as the EFTA Court, for example, provides that level of institutional stability and therefore trust, which would actually deliver much of what is being asked for in the Chequers Declaration? So it would be interesting to know why is it that we don't just sign up to the EFTA Court and dock to the EFTA Court?
Yeah, this is true, by the way, not only on the judicial side but also on the administrative side. To come back to an example that Ali used earlier, state aid. Now, the Chequers Agreement refers to a common rulebook on state aid. The defining characteristic of EU state aid rules is not the rules themselves, it's the Commission being the virtual sole enforcer of the state aid rules. Who is going to do the job of the Commission for the UK? It's very doubtful that the EU would accept that a UK public body polices UK public aid, because it doesn't accept that for itself, it doesn't accept that for the EEA, it relies on the EFTA Surveillance Authority. So I think that the problems are parallel in both administrative and judicial senses.
Yeah, so I think the key point there is that this isn't about words on a piece of paper, it's about the institutions, and institutions which of course have taken decades to build. Perhaps Mr. Newman, you could comment on that. I mean, how realistic is it that we get to December 2020, the end of the transition period, and we've built a set of bespoke institutions that have the buy-in and trust that has taken decades to build across.
Sure, I'm personally open to docking into the EFTA Corp. That was something that we recommended in our paper. But equally, as Professor Newcomb was saying, there are already a series of examples of arbitration mechanisms that the EU already has in place. CETA has one, for example. So I don't think actually that is that complicated. I also think the whole question around trust, I understand at one level the European Commission's concerned, but equally Britain is a very rules-based country with very powerful and independent institutions, and I don't think it's really that plausible to think that Britain is suddenly going to go totally rogue and start ignoring commitments that we've made in international or indeed in domestic law. I just think that's just not a picture that I would recognise for this country at all, and particularly after decades and decades of membership where we've followed all the rules, sometimes argued around the table for particular opt-outs and so on, but equally we've been very careful members. I think the Commission should take a slightly more benevolent view about our ability to be a trusted partner in the future.
Can I just come in on that, though? I think you're talking about trust at too high a level. This isn't about whether you're a trustworthy country and a civilised place that plays by the rules. This is about the daily nuts and bolts of the way jobs get done.
Sure.
And one of the things that you see in EU law, and this is the sort of bread and butter of my daily work, it's the little failures of trust between authorities. It's when your insurance certificate isn't properly recognised by a French authority. It's when your forklift truck is criticised by a minister in Finland. It's the tiny hundreds of little failures of trust that risk the system.
So I accept that, but I think that there is and that is obviously has to be resolved with clear binding rules and so on. Absolutely. But I think there's also a rhetoric that we see from the Commission, particularly on unattributed sources, which does actually speak to my wider point about the UK suddenly becoming an untrustworthy country. I just don't recognise that.
There is a domestic implementation model under, I think, the Ukraine Association Agreement for state aid, but the difference there is that I don't think necessarily, and I defer to the Professor on this, I don't think because Ukraine is starting from here and the UK is here and talking about an actual common rulebook, I don't think Ukraine has signed up fully to the complete package of state aid rules in the way that the UK is necessarily proposing. So the more you talk about a common rulebook, the more you potentially do need a surveillance authority.
Just one very brief quote. I mean, we haven't really touched on the agencies. I think there are 49 or 50 EU agencies. Can you say very briefly a couple of words about how you see the Chequers statement relating to the issue of the agencies? Because we know that in, I think, about half of the cases, the agencies have no provision for participation of third countries in any way, shape or form. And then there are a number where you have to be EEA in order to get observer status at least. Broadly speaking, what's your... I mean, I think this plays absolutely into the issue of institutions and trust. The role of the agencies in the context of the Chequers agreement, I'd be grateful for your take on that. Starting with Mr. Newman.
I mean, there are obviously some pretty fundamental concerns in that direction. Equally, there are examples of non-EEA states participating in certain agencies like Switzerland and the Aviation Safety Agency. But I think Professor Dugan can speak to more of the technicalities on that. I think another huge area we haven't discussed, we spent the entire morning discussing the economic relationship. I think more profoundly concerning in many respects is the security relationship. And that's obviously a detail in the Chequers statement, but talking to any officials inside government who are working on security, they're profoundly concerned by the attitude that the Commission and also member states are taking. The UK is not asking to sit at the table and make decisions on internal security and so on, but we are asking to make sure that operational capabilities don't fall off. And I think that is profoundly at risk, and it's something that I hope the Commission takes very, very seriously.
Just very quickly, in answering the final question.
Agencies are a bit like equivalency regimes in the field of financial services. There's no single model. They vary about whether it's available and the nature of participation in a relatively ad hoc way. I think this is one of the areas where until we know better what the common rulebook scope is meant to be, is it literal border checks or is it a common market for goods? We can't really know which agencies will be relevant and therefore where the legislation might fulfil the UK's aspirations or where we might need to say to the EU, can you change your legislation? And I think just to come back on Henry's point, it's easy, I think, to sort of say politically this seems crazy, politically this seems unacceptable. If the legislation says you cannot participate, then you either have to live with that legislation or you have to change it.
Change the statute.
And now we're asking the EU to change its rules to accommodate us. But I think the politics and the law have to work constructively together there rather than seeing one or the other as an absolute obstacle.
Okay.
Thank you.
Pat McFadden.
I'll try to keep it brief because we've covered a lot of the ground. The heart of the Chequers proposal is the idea that you can separate things. You can separate goods and services. You can separate from the Common Rule Book things like employment, environmental and consumer rights. You can separate from all of this questions of freedom of movement and money. At a sort of general level, before asking about some of these particulars, how likely do you think it is that the European Union side of the table will agree to that basic concept that you can separate all these things out?
I think it's on goods and services particularly. I think it's and that depends on what comes out of the white paper. I think you're talking about differentiated levels of access rather than separating them entirely. I think the bigger question is that question around movement of persons, which, again, to the Professor's point, since particularly 2014, has been seen as pretty inextricably linked, at least to goods in terms of the arrangement that Switzerland has. So it's not so much the separation, it's the separation of regulatory alignment and the separation of access. And there are examples of that they have done, but it really depends on to what extent we're going to put, and that's why it would be helpful, but I'm not holding out a huge amount of hope that there will be a huge amount talking about what replaces freedom of movement in the white paper.
It's always possible to separate these things out, and lawyers love it because, of course, it means that we'll have a lifetime of income arguing about the separation. But the separation in itself isn't a problem. I think the real issues are twofold. First of all, it's about the overall package, and I think we talked about that before. But what is it we're asking for, and what is it we're prepared to give? And until we see the white paper, we don't know what the overall package will look like, and therefore whether it will be acceptable from an indivisibility or cherry-picking point of view. But the other factor to bear in mind, of course, is the impact on the EU's wider relations with third countries. I would mention Switzerland before. Can the EU really give the UK an extensive deal on goods but not on persons, when the Swiss might immediately turn around and say, will you refuse to do that for us? But equally, for example, on customs, at the moment the Commission has already asked the Council for a negotiating mandate to renegotiate the customs relationship with Turkey. The Commission and the other Member States will be very sensitive about whether what the UK has asked for and what the UK might be given could end up with the Turkish state saying, well, we want some of that as well. Why can't that work for us? So I think it's about the package between the UK and the EU, but it has to be located within the wider network of relations, and the EU will be quite sensitive about destabilising relations with other third countries or leading them to say, we want special treatment too.
There's a lot to agree with that. I think obviously the Swiss example offers, in many senses, the best precedent for what the UK is trying to seek. We're asking for something quite different from the Swiss because we're asking for this to be governed by essentially a single partnership rather than many different meshing bilateral agreements. But we're also saying very clearly there will be a dispute resolution mechanism, including binding arbitration. So I think in that respect it should be more acceptable to the EU side. But I think fundamentally this is an unknown. We don't know how far this is a political decision for the Council ultimately to take, and they are fighting on many different fronts. They have obviously profound concerns about the instability in the eastern part of the Union, as well as their relationship with Member States, as well as what's happening in Italy and so on. So I think we're asking, at some level, we're asking quite a lot of the Council at a time when they have many other profound distractions. At the same time, I think that resolving in a fair and sustainable way their relationship with the continent's second biggest economy is crucial, and Britain is not going to go away as a inverted commas problem for the EU. Equally, there are very profound problems within the EU around movement of persons more generally. Now, those aren't exactly the same problems that the UK is asking to resolve, but there are broader issues and broader questions. I think what worries me is, of course, the legal details are extremely important, and the EU as a legally based institution will see things through those mechanisms. But in terms of a deep strategic thinking about how is this relationship going to work on this continent, which we're all sharing as a result of geography over the next few decades, how can we find a relationship with the UK that works in the medium to long term, rather than the UK is sort of forced into in the short term is profoundly important. I don't think when I speak to diplomats and officials at senior level in France or Germany, they've really given that this much thought. They're looking for a way through, and they're essentially leaving a lot of this to the Commission. But they admit themselves they don't have a plan for what they want to do with this. So I hope very much that the EU takes this very seriously, because I think clearly, given the resignations this week, this has been a profound compromise for the government to have made, and I think they should recognise how far the government has moved. If they throw it back in the Prime Minister's face, then I think that could be very difficult, and I'm worried about how that could then go forward.
We haven't heard yet. I just want to ask, I mean, I agree with you that the closest existing parallel to what the government wants after last weekend is probably Switzerland, where there has been some separation of at least goods and financial services, which is not part of their arrangement. But we know what the price of that has been, if you like, for Switzerland, in the sense that there's been an insistence on free movement, and there's been an insistence on some payments. So just on those fronts, on free movement, I mean, what's the difference between free movement and a mobility partnership with preferential access for EU citizens? Is there a danger that we get caught up too much in what things are called, or is a mobility partnership with preferential access for EU citizens really free movement where you fill in some forms?
They are different things.
They are. I think they could be substantively different, because if you talk about, if the only basis for the labour mobility scheme or any preferential scheme for EU nationals and vice versa is Mode 4, that really predominantly deals with temporary movement, intercorporate transfers. So the question is that, and obviously free movement itself has very clear legal underpinnings in terms of non-discrimination, access to social security, etc. And that's a very different question about a preferential labour mobility scheme. So that's why there is this big question about, is it going to be free movement with controls? And I think the Home Secretary said something in the last few days that there was going to be no free movement derivative or anything like that, or it's just going to be something that's based around Mode 4. Now, there is the opportunity, I suppose, in some respects, for the UK, the EU to agree the most ambitious Mode 4 agreement that has ever been created, because there hasn't been much progress of that between countries, or certainly at the WTO level. But that really sort of deals with temporary professional movement, and that's very different from having a general, scheme that says you are entitled still to come here even if you don't have a job offer. And that is effectively, even though there are limitations within free movement, the 3-month sort of self-sufficiency rule, that is very different to what free movement entails.
Very briefly, I think the Swiss model obviously provides an example, but there are others as well. Jersey has a particular relationship that also divides goods and services. Equally, we talked previously about the Ukraine, Georgian, Moldovan association agreements. There are other agreements that the EU has made with states that were acceding to the Union, the Czech Republic or Czechoslovak agreement originally, that separated free movement of goods and people, albeit for a time-limited period. But so the indivisibility point has been bridged previously, but that's a political judgment for the EU side to make.
Can I just ask a final question on something else? We touched, Christopher Chope's gone now, but he was asking you about machinery of government issues. Where do you think DEXU stands after the last week? We obviously have a kind of selfish interest in this because we're the committee that shadows it. But from the outside, it looks like DEXU was kind of downgraded the day that Ollie Robbins left and went to the centre, to number 10 in the Cabinet Office, to be the key person on this. I mean, where does DEXU really stand in this going forward? And is there really a point to having DEXU?
I think the government's obviously decided there is a point to having it. I think there needs to be a coordinating function in Whitehall. My personal view was that this should have been driven out of the Cabinet Office from the beginning. There already was the European Secretariat there, and it would have made sense simply to use that. I think once Ivan Rogers departed, Ollie Robbins was trying to do several different roles simultaneously: provide advice to the Prime Minister, provide advice to the Brexit Secretary, sometimes in some cases different advice, but also serving as a permanent secretary running a department. And that was spreading him, I think, far too thinly. I think DEXU, nonetheless, has a role, and they've decided that there needs to be somebody actually doing some coordination work. I heard earlier in the week from officials in DEXU that there were plans to take some powers away from the department and to make further sort of moves towards bolstering the team in the Cabinet Office at the expense of DEXU. I had that very strongly denied from people in number 10, but that was my understanding previously.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard Graham.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning to all three of you. Ali Renison, can I just check with you? In your excellent February paper, the IOD talked about the opportunities for free trade agreements, including on important tariffs on food and wider agricultural items that critics of the Customs Union routinely point to. Clearly, the inclusion of agricultural products in the Common Rule Book in the Chequers proposals rules that out. Is your understanding that basically that is the case? And secondly, do you accept that if that is, it's because it's the price of a solution for Northern Ireland that preserves the integrity of the UK and allows for manageable border arrangements?
I'll take the questions in turn. I think I would agree to a certain extent with Henry that a lot of the desire to remain aligned on SPS measures does derive from not agreeing to the backstop as currently drafted by the EU as the option for the future relationship. Although I would say that, listening to sort of various farming groups, there is a keen desire to maintain, it's a reputational issue as well. That if you look at, for example, there have been agreements between, belatedly, but the Agricultural Horticultural Development Board and their sort of counterpart in China to talk about sort of export licensing for the pork industry, and that has lots of references to EEA law, and there's a question mark about whether in terms of the international recognition of UK law, that would be sort of sufficient to replicate it. So there are, independent of the Northern Irish question, there are actual genuine desires to remain aligned. But I wouldn't necessarily say, I think that what was in that report was looking chiefly but not totally independent of tariff alignment. Now in the Turkish Customs Union arrangement, they are obliged to follow EU rules on industrial standards. So I think it would be matter for debate whether if you included, if you had regulatory alignment on SPS measures, that would necessarily extend to tariff alignment. I see those two things as broadly different.
Thank you. And do you agree that actually having an alignment here on agricultural products will make it easier to roll over the existing EU free trade arrangements?
Well, yes and no. So presumably you're specifically talking about on regulatory issues in respect of agriculture. On the one hand, yes, but on the other hand, no, because you can't, if the UK is not subject party to the EEA agreement, you can't just, a lot of the references in some of these trade agreements do specifically reference EEA law. So you do have to look in some areas, I guess cutting and pasting works, but the point is you can't just continue to be party to things because you're not formally party to the EEA agreement anymore. But I think it's also important to recognize that some of these agreements are also not necessarily under the purview of DIT. So some of the wine and spirits agreements that we have done are independent of sort of, I would say, EU agri-food rules and more to do with what's been negotiated on geographical indications, for example.
Okay, thank you. Professor Duggan, in terms of how things go forward from here, I think you've rightly said that the key decision is going to be a political one rather than a legal one, but nonetheless, as we know, the Commission is very focused on processes. So my question really is, what is there that you've seen so far in the Chequers proposals that you think is likely to cause most concern to the Commission in terms of processes, and what do you see as the likely way through that? For example, could the Commission issue new negotiating guidelines which the Council of Ministers signs up to long before the October meeting?
Okay. In terms of sort of what the Commission will be looking for in the White Paper, what we've already said several times, what is the scope of this common rule book? Is it border checks or is it a common market for trading goods? Will the customs proposals be workable? Will they just be actually capable of functioning without creating undue bureaucracy and without creating undue burdens, not only for UK business and authorities, but for EU business and authorities? Something that we haven't touched on yet is the scope of the level playing field guarantees, because the Chequers statement mentions a few areas, but doesn't mention all of the relevant ones. It doesn't deal with, for example, corporate taxation or public procurement or intellectual property protection, and it doesn't talk about the future evolution of environmental or employment or consumer standards. So there'll be deep questions about the level playing field guarantees. Okay. Institutionally, they will want to know, I think they'll feel happy with the idea of the joint committee and the arbitration panel with the reference procedure. They'll want guarantees about asymmetry in the domestic legal effects of the agreement between the UK and the EU. They'll want to know whether the Northern Irish backstop can now be signed on the basis of the EU proposals rather than the UK's alternative. And finally, they'll want to know about the cherry picking. They want to see the overall deal and match whether it amounts to something which feels like the UK isn't trying to have its cake and eat it. So I think there's a long checklist of things that the EU as a whole will be looking out for. There are a couple of other important questions which will need to be clarified. For example, the Chequers statement doesn't say anything about the UK's potential input into the future evolution of the Common Rulebook. Now, in the case of the EEA, in the case of Turkey, their officials are consulted by the Commission, they attend many of the expert meetings, they do have opportunities to feed into the development of both primary and secondary legislation at the EU level. They'll want to know what the British ideas are for UK input into EU decision-making and rule-making as well. So a range of things that I think I'd be looking out for if I worked for the Commission or for another member state.
Thank you. And lastly, Henry Newman, everything we've said today really comes down to the question of how the Chequers proposals and the White Paper are received in Europe. You've said that the risks have been raised either for an unsustainable deal or no deal at all. You worked for trade leave and of course for vote leave, and of course some of those who voted leave don't really want to see a deal at all. But for those who want to respect the referendum and allow minimum disruption of lives and jobs, is there anything that you've seen in the Chequers proposals that really justifies the cries of betrayal?
Well, I think it's Chequers proposal is a very substantial compromise. I think that's clearly the case. It's not. It's a lot closer to the European Union than many Brexiteers would have wanted. I think that's. Wouldn't necessarily choose the words you just used, but I think that's. And people have to judge whether they think this is a appropriate compromise to make or broadly in the right position. I think from my point of view, a compromise is needed. Parliament is divided. The country is divided. We need a way through. We need a plan. We need a plan that's also negotiable, not just around the cabinet table, nor in Parliament, but also with the EU itself. And I think this is a fair and reasonable offer to make to the European side. Of course, they might turn around and say no, thank you. In which case, I think, as you said, other options are becoming more likely.
I would like to come back, I think, to one of the opening questions that the Chair was asking, because one of the things that hasn't really come up substantively yet is this question about how much does X alignment constrain your ability to negotiate in future trade agreements. Firstly, I think you can't only see this through the perspective of what you can do in future trade agreements, and we know from from the survey work we do with our own membership that the priority by almost 5-1 is the EU negotiations over new trade agreements for the time being. But secondly, I think it's really important to actually try and explore that, because if you look at some of the trade agreements that Iceland has signed with China, and Iceland is fully in the single market for goods and services, it is still able to negotiate on technical barriers to trade. And so trying to figure out what actually poses a constraint and what doesn't is probably quite important. Similarly, Norway is in the single market, has adopted the data protection rules, but in the negotiations on TISA, on the Trade and Services Agreement, the plurilateral agreement, it put in a different offer to the EU on sort of data transfers. So I think that it's important to sort of tease out actually what the constraints do place and what they don't do in future trade policy.
Indeed. The reason I didn't ask you about that was simply because time was scarce, and I'm personally very convinced there are huge opportunities for trade agreements, and the Prime Minister has highlighted the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is probably the most exciting of them all.
Right, I think just briefly, as Ali said at the very start, clearly the ability to if the FCA, the customs arrangement, is accepted by the other side, it would allow us to alter tariffs on agricultural products. And of course, Switzerland has been able to make trade deals with other countries independently while still broadly following agricultural rules and the, quote, common rule book on goods. So there are options there which I think should be helpful.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a very, very interesting session today. I want to just follow up on a couple of the points just raised by my colleague and, in a sense, come back to where we started. At the very end of the Chequers statement, in the preparedness section, it says, but we also concluded that it was responsible to continue preparations for a range of potential outcomes, including the possibility of no deal. I want to just ask you two very specific questions in relation to that. If we assume for a minute that we leave without a deal,